If not, I'll share.
A good question on democracy running.
Is there a button there?
Well, you know,
Yeah.
but having seen
Yeah.
enough screwed up democracies, I think there's, you know, maybe we should run a few. You know, maybe.
Okay, hello, very good afternoon to you, everybody. My name is Desi Anwar, and it's a pleasure and honor for me to chair this session, building around bottlenecks, upgrading Asia's infrastructure. And for those of you who are new to Jakarta, a very great welcome to this city. And I think bottleneck is an apt way to describe this city. As a matter of fact, Jakarta is becoming one of those cities where we don't ever experience a rush hour. Every minute is the rush hour. And I have a fair notion why this conference is held on a Sunday. It's because it's the only day where we can get anywhere actually on time and not be late. And also it's the one day during the week where Jakartans can actually enjoy the roads, because some parts of the roads are actually closed for cars for a few hours. So everybody can actually go out and do something else, such as biking. Now, the thing about economic growth, especially in Indonesia, it has not been matched by infrastructure growth. As I've mentioned, the number of cars in the last 4 or 5 years have grown dramatically, and it has not been served with the proper infrastructure. For example, we haven't, even Jakarta has not seen one single new road in the last decade. And the other thing is that if every year, for example, we celebrate what we call the Earth Hour, where cities switch off the electricity for 1 hour, we can be sure that every week somewhere in some part of the country, and even in Jakarta, we experience regular blackouts. And we mentioned that Indonesia is number 2 after the United States when it comes to social networking, such as Facebook and Twitter. And we actually have an exponential growth in terms of internet penetration. And yet, we are still downloading the internet in terms of kilobytes. And as we can see, the lack of basic infrastructure, whether it's a road or whether it's our connectivity, it's slowing down the growth, it's hampering our economy, and it's a lot of time wasted, a lot of fuel wasted on the road, a lot of wasted productivity, and it's costly for our growth. So you need more time, more fuel, more effort when the infrastructure could actually help to support this growth. So the session that I will be chairing this afternoon is called Building Around the Bottlenecks, Upgrading Asia's Infrastructure, and the question is, how could Asian infrastructure be implemented so it will support growth rather than hamper growth? And I have with me 6 extremely distinguished panelists. Welcome, gentlemen. And the first one is Dominic Barton, Worldwide Managing Director, McKinsey & Company from the UK, and also the co-chair of World Economic Forum on East Asia. Dominic, welcome. And Ajit Gulabchand, all the way from India, Chairman and Managing Director of Hindustan Construction Company. Stuart Gulliver, Group Chief Executive of HSBC Holdings UK, and also co-chair of the WEF on East Asia. Madhu Koneru, Executive Vice Chairman, Minerals, Energy and Commodities from the United Arab Emirates. John Rice, Vice Chairman from General Electric Company, GE in Hong Kong. And last but not least, Gita Wirjawan, Chairman of Indonesia's Investment Coordinating Board. Welcome, gentlemen. My first question, perhaps more pertinent for you, Dominic, as we talk about the infrastructure policy, particularly in Asian countries. And what do you see are the main challenges that Asian countries are facing when it comes to implementing infrastructure policies? And what is the best way for governments in developing countries to actually plan out their infrastructure policies?
Well, I think there's a quite a wide range of issues that are there, and more qualified people than me to talk about it. For example, in the financing side, the long-term savings, pension funds, and so forth, and then the people actually doing the construction and working with the government if it's a private-public partnership. What I'd just like to focus on is one specific part, which is more operational, and that is really around the regulatory complexity when you try and get something done. So when you look at things like land rights or land usage, this can be a big bottleneck for people to be able to get it through. So if you are running a road that cuts across provinces or different jurisdictions, which we see in actually many Asian countries, and you have to negotiate with each local government as to what the rules are, that can be incredibly frustrating in terms of how you work it. I think that the second issue is around the prioritization. We know, as others again will speak, there's roughly between $8 to $10 trillion of infrastructure that's required over the next 10 years in Asia. The question is, how do you prioritize that? And if you're going to go and want to do that with a particular government, what's first priority? What's on the rank order? And what you find in a number of the countries in Asia is there's a whole hodgepodge of them that are there. Different interests have different views as to whether it's the power or roads or airports and so forth. So getting a very clear sense of priority is key. And the third area is really around just the regulatory certainty that goes with this, which I think is a big issue. A lot of the infrastructure requirements are greenfield, not brownfield, and if you're a pension fund, that can worry you because you don't have anything to base it off in terms of looking at what true consumer demand is like. How many cars will actually go on that road? How will pricing be done in that particular utility? And so we have a lot of greenfield requirements. So what's the arrangement that we can put in place that can help those funds that actually have a lot of money and do want to invest, I'm talking about outside the country itself, have some certainty in terms of how they're going to be able to do that? And I think that right now, I'm generalizing, but I would say across the region, except perhaps for some of the cities in China, where there's a little more clarity and certainty around it, it just takes too long and it's too complex to be able to get it done. You get too much of a headache trying to work it through, and yet we need to do it. And I would hope that we could have, if we could get a reference case, if I was in a country and had the decision rights, if you will, to have a reference case to show how we can actually go from the idea to the design, the cooperation, and the implementation in a period of time. That, I think, would accelerate what we could be doing in other parts of the region, but also in that country.
Dominic, certainly land issues, regulations, these are the problems that Indonesia is currently facing. But what advice would you give to governments such as in Indonesia who are having difficulties in actually implementing those projects? And how would you recommend that they should prioritize?
Well, one thing is, on the prioritization, I have a feel, we'll hear from Gita, I think they probably do have a good sense of the priorities. I think the thing is to take, as I said, a reference case and, if you will, fast track it. The problem is there's not a lot of best practices around the world. I can't point to a country that does this in an outstanding manner. Maybe some other colleagues can. But what I will say is there's two countries that are now going for it. One is Colombia and one is Chile. And the Colombians are basically saying, the president is saying, you come and we've figured out these priorities and we will work with you to figure out what all the bottlenecks are and where they are with the investors and all of the different players. And I think if we could focus in Indonesia on one or two sort of lighthouse projects and actually map out what it is that would be required. Some changes may not be possible. For example, on the land use, I'm not sure again what degrees of freedom the government would have. But if you can at least lay that out and have total awareness of where that is and a commitment, almost a fast tracking of trying to de-bottleneck it, I think then we could move it. But I'd focus on one or two to get them right, and then you replicate it as opposed to have a whole pile of them going at one time, which could be frustrating a lot of people.
But Colombia,
Colombia and Chile.
Do they have land issues?
They have land. They've got tons of. They've got security issues.
How did they actually?
Well, unfortunate thing is they haven't done it yet. They're doing it, if you will, and that's the. But there's a commitment. President Santos has said we it's what it was you mentioned at the beginning. You're not going to get. They're trying to raise their GDP growth by 3 percentage points. It's going to require infrastructure to do it. So he's got a whole communication program around. It's in all of our interests to be able to get this infrastructure done because we're all going to be better off. So there's a big communication program going on in the country to explain to people, and then they're just in the process now of driving it. But as I said, it's not done. There's just a commitment from the president to deliver, if you will, to drive it, to then be able to replicate it. And the same as in Chile. The only thing I'd say that's different about Chile is the earthquake actually, I say this in all respect, actually helped, because you've got to build hospitals and you've got to build schools and you've got to build roads in record time. They were forced to, and that led to some changes.
I remember even 10 years ago, there's talk about 10,000 kilometers of roads will be built around the country and 10,000 megawatts and so on and so forth. And until now, unfortunately, the proof, as I say, is in the pudding. But Ajit, you're from India, as a construction infrastructure company, India. How do they do it in India, also, which is in an extremely high growth country with a huge population? I'm particularly interested in, for example, in how to solve the mass rapid transportation system, which until now, unfortunately, Jakarta, even though it's a huge metropolis of 12 million people, we still do not yet have adequate, efficient MRT. How do you do it in India?
Well, India is a mixed story. You have grand successes at some end, and there are utter failures at the other end. We have some structural problems in the sense that our local self-government, cities and towns, are not managed by themselves. Whilst the states do, and there is a very strong central government, it's too large a country, and a lot of urban infrastructure is not getting built because it does not have powerful town and city governments. In addition to that, there are certain issues of certainty of policy on environmental issues, on land acquisition, on some of the economic viability, because what needs to be charged to a population that is not likely to pay adequately for the public services that the infrastructure entails, do lead to an economic viability problem that remains unresolved. And these are issues that are bogging India down.
Could you give us some examples of those issues?
For example, on one side, we had a National Highway Authority that has been extremely successful. It created a new model of public-private partnership, and before this authority was put into place, we were doing building 11 kilometers of roads per year. We came up to building 11 kilometers of roads per day, because of a new kind of public-private partnership where, barring the ownership of the roads, almost everything was done privately by outsourcing, including in most of the roads where investment would be private as well. Now, this was very successful. It runs into trouble from time to time. It slows down. But even when it slows down, we're still able to achieve about 10 kilometers of roads per day. And I think this has been a successful way of dealing with it, because the infrastructure to be built is so much and so quickly, particularly because of the large migration to cities that we are now seeing. About 400 million people will expect to migrate to cities in India in the next 30 to 40 years, a migration that took place in Europe over 1,000 years. And this kind of migration is very difficult to handle. So it does require more local self-governments to deal with it, a more certainty of regulation, which is very difficult because various constituencies of environment, of social equity, as well as financial viability, affordability, are constantly at loggerheads with each other in trying to make sure that they are all incorporated into a project. Very often, after the project is under implementation. This has caused a number of problems. Yet, as I told you, it's a mixed story of successes at some end, and lots of things that should have started 10 years ago are yet to begin.
So is there overlap between, for example, local government and central government when it comes to building infrastructure? And especially in terms of
The
funding and
Constitution of
permits
India,
and regulations?
Constitution of India lays down very clear rules of what can be governed by the states and what can be governed by the central government. There are some concurrent lists, and they tend to overlap sometimes. But the fact remains that, whilst this is the case, not enough authorities and autonomies exist with the states to be able to carry out their own programs because of the imbalanced distribution of funds, of taxes collected between the states and the center. And due to excessive centralization, which came with central planning soon after independence, there has been a tendency of central dominance, which then does not allow local self-governments to adequately grow on their own. Wherever they have been allowed, particularly after liberalization, we have seen some of the states grow at even growth rates of 14%, and that has been quite remarkable. But nevertheless, you will find, therefore, for every bad story in India, there is also a good story, because it's substantially private sector-led growth, and it has been able to cope with whatever reforms have allowed it to do so, and has been able to overcome the shortcomings that are even prevalent in spite of lack of the government policies and certainty.
Okay, Ajit, perhaps you could give us an example. For example, is there an MRT in Mumbai?
There is a mass rapid transit system in Mumbai for the last almost 70, 80 years. But that is woefully inadequate to the population of Bombay today. And it requires a much bigger system, a much wider network in order to
And is that being built?
It is being built for the last 20 years and not yet started.
Okay, and for things like that, or maybe in other cities, for example, how long does it take for a project, for example,
no, for
to
example,
get
as I told you,
off the ground?
In this particular case, Bombay does not manage itself. It is subject to the state government of Maharashtra, of which Bombay is the capital. And that works with the central government, and particularly the railway ministry, in order to create this particular mass rapid transit system. Some of the states have taken up the model and begun their privatization, like in Andhra Pradesh. The Hyderabad mass rapid transit system is being created by the state government for the city of Hyderabad through a public-private partnership process. And that has just begun. Similarly, Delhi had an example of two actually public sectors, that central government and the Delhi government coming together, sharing 50-50 equity in a mass rapid transit system, a local subway system for Delhi. So some such mixed public sector undertakings working with each other in order to create that has been able to work, because people are not willing to pay the kind of prices that economic viability of such systems demands, and therefore calls for an element of viability gap funding or subsidies which only state-run units can give. And therefore, you have a success in Delhi. It is expected to be replicated in Hyderabad with, on a completely private basis. Bangalore is looking at it. Calcutta is entirely a government of India undertaking. So we have a whole different types of models being worked out, but we haven't made the kind of progress Indian cities need.
Okay. Stuart, perhaps this is a good moment to actually talk about the financing. Obviously, building infrastructure is an expensive business. Somebody has to foot the bill, especially, government budget doesn't stretch that far. And we've talked about private-public partnership. And what would you say about the best way of financing infrastructure projects? And what kind of return of interest are we talking about that investors are, before they are interested in financing such projects?
It's an interesting, the number that Dominic mentioned, $8 trillion of infrastructure spend, seems on the face of it a daunting number. And here in Indonesia, the estimate is about $250 billion over the next 5 years if you're going to build your 10,000 kilometers of road and so on. But actually, if you look at it, Asia's got a colossally high savings rate. So there's a huge amount of private money, but it sits in the banking system, and it sits in very short-term deposits. Asia's also got a colossal amount of reserves, which sit with sovereign wealth funds and central banks, and that goes and funds basically the debt of Western Europe and the United States. What the issue is of mobilizing funds. It actually isn't there's a shortage of money. The Minister of Finance of Indonesia said on a panel that I was on this morning that the fiscal revenues or the fiscal receipts here in Indonesia can only fund about 20% of the requirement. But what you need to do is to mobilize the money that's around, which essentially requires the build-out of really two things and simultaneously. First of all, there needs to be a push to create a pensions industry and a mandatory pensions industry. And then secondly, alongside that, an insurance industry, and then you essentially develop bond markets. Because if you can get people to start saving in pensions and start saving in life products, then the maturity transformation is much easier. Because if you save in a pension, you're saving for 30 years. The pension fund manager can therefore lend 30-year money for someone to build a bridge, a power station, a road. As long as the money sits either in bank deposits and is therefore too short term for that maturity transformation to work within the banking system, and by definition, if it sits in US Treasuries, it's not actually building infrastructure in Asia. So there's an issue of mobilization. There's not an issue actually of a shortfall of money. And there are several well-established techniques to deal with greenfield sites versus brownfield sites. And actually, if you're running a pension fund or an insurance company, project finance tends to be an extremely good way of diversifying your risk, because project finance, whether it's investing as an equity holder in a venture capital way, or it's a public-private partnership in a greenfield site, or it's a project bond, tends not to correlate with equity markets. It actually provides them with diversification. And actually, the two countries in Asia ex-Japan that have done well with infrastructure are Hong Kong and Singapore, both of which have effectively mandatory provident funds, both of which have therefore created pools of long-term money, and both of which therefore have been able to build world-class infrastructure very quickly. What they've also, though, managed to do is to clear all of the red tape to enable those to be built within short order. So I actually think the infrastructure requirement of Asia is absolutely fundable, because the money is absolutely there. But unless that mobilization takes place, and that, frankly, is country by country, it's a domestic agenda, because what you really want to do is to mobilize the domestic savings here in Indonesia, not to be reliant on hot money that from time to time might want to come to Indonesia because QE is happening at the moment in America and dollars are free. That gives you that long-term sustainable thing. So it's the creation of a contractual savings industry that's so critical. And both Hong Kong and Singapore did it by actually creating a mandatory requirement for people to save for their retirement. Which then has the beauty of providing you with the capital to build your infrastructure, and you create a virtuous circle.
We have a lot of liquidity at the moment in Indonesia. Like you said, the problem is not actually the amount of money. It's there, but it's mobilizing.
Yes, it's mobilizing, and the maturity which it's prepared to stay for. You know, if the money is there short term, it's not going to finance a 20-year project.
Stuart, you're from HSBC, and HSBC is quite big in Indonesia. How attractive is Indonesian's infrastructure project for a bank like
No, they would be completely attractive, but they can't be financed by bank financing. The roles that banks will play is as an intermediary. So we'll play a role in terms of pricing project bonds. We'll play a role in terms of the risk management of the projects. But the end investors have to be people who are prepared to take 20 or 30-year risk. And as I say, that's the life insurance industry. That's the pension fund industry. It's not your commercial banks. Your commercial investment banks will provide the advisory work, the project and export finance advisory to structure it, how to put the project bonds together, how to put the PPP partnerships together, but they're not the end investors. The end investors need to be done, and that requires a government initiative. And that government initiative itself tends to be a joint venture between government and the banking industry in a particular country. And again, both Singapore and Hong Kong have done this in the last 20 years.
Okay, I'd like to turn to you now, to Madhu. MEC is an investor in Indonesia. If I understand it, you're actually building a railway in East Kalimantan to support your coal company there. Now, could you tell us, Madhu, perhaps as an investor, how is the project, the infrastructure project, coming along? You're also building a power plant there, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, are there any sort of difficulties in actually implementing the project? And perhaps you could share with us the progress.
We're building a 140-kilometer railway track, trying to link the energy to...
Sorry, could you speak closer to the mic?
Is that better? We are building a 140-kilometer railway track, That's primarily to connect the coal mines for export as well as to create other industries within the region. Hearing a lot of the bottlenecks, what we have been discussing here about, and what experience we have is completely different. Probably it's one of those projects which is on the good side of the story. We've been here for the last 3 years as a company, but most of our people here, the way they settle and the way they work in the project is almost like we've been here for the last 30 years. I think a lot of the mistake, what a lot of the foreign investors do is, when they land into Jakarta, they first go to the lawyer's office and try to understand Indonesia, which is a big mistake, because the lawyers give you the completely wrong perception. They only talk the negative things of Indonesia, and whereas Indonesia is more about what's happening on the ground. What we've done is we have engaged the local government a lot. We've engaged the local people. We've engaged the central government people. There have been 3 years back when we had asked bids for some of the contractors in the region, refused to bid because they never believed this could ever happen. So then we had to engage the contractors with the local government and the regional government to build the confidence in. So it's all about the confidence of each one of those stakeholders, because I don't think a railway track can just be built by us. We can't just write one check and start buying all the land and everything is done. There are various stakeholders in it. And the biggest job what we do in the process is that we try to engage all the stakeholders, make each one of them keep on meeting. That's how I have a lot of visitors for Gita's office regularly. I bring US Exim, I bring GE, I bring Standard Chartered Bank, the banks, I bring the regional governments. I have introduced international banks to the Bhupati in the region. I mean, Bhupati is just one of the regional leaders. We've taken to him, and the Bhupati hears what the bank wants from an international perspective, and then he tries to find solutions for some of the issues which are there. And then I bring the Bhupati back into Jakarta, make him sit with the central government and try to find a solution. And most of the government which is sitting in Jakarta understand international business. It is the local government which does not understand. So you got to engage both of them. They feel comfortable with each other. We have land acquisition is one issue which we have been dealing it on a case-to-case basis. This is like golf. You play shot by shot. Don't try to play all the shots in one shot. So we go piece by piece, one by one. Each and every department has got a different issue. You got to handle them in that specific manner. The good thing in land acquisition is, I can tell you, probably it's in India and other places, the difference in Indonesia is that the difference in the political parties is only during the election time. When it comes to development and finding a solution, it really doesn't matter which political party the regional government is or the central government is. They don't really, they all meet and they talk. That's a good thing, The second thing is with regard to the policies. Letting you build your own private railway is the biggest opportunity you could ever get in the world. You can't do it in Australia. You can't do it in Colombia. You can't do it in US. It's a fantastic opportunity. There will be challenges going forward, but we see it as a big opportunity for us. There is nowhere else in the world, even in India, you build your own railway track, you build it and hand over it back to the government. So we see that as a fantastic opportunity, and we would like to get involved and face the challenges rather than just running away from the challenges. Coming to the approvals, there's a solution for that too. There have been problems of approvals forever, but a couple of years back, when I sat with BKPM officials and I said, I will do the land acquisition, I will invest the money, but what are you going to do with the approvals? They gave me a confidence. Again, it's all about the confidence what you build with each other and the trust you build with each other. They said, you carry on, we will find you a solution. And as of last month, they have announced our project in the 9 special corridors. If 2 years back or 3 years back, I was waiting for that announcement to come, we wouldn't have progressed where we are. We have been announced, our project is part of the 9 special corridors, where the President has given instructions to all the ministries to give special clearances to these 9 projects. And I think these 9 projects have been selected on certain basis of certain development which is already done. So I think it's more of guys who are already committed, we push them first. And we are getting our approvals. May not be as easy as it is, but it's moving. It's always important to move, not just get stuck somewhere. And it may move slowly because the country is big. So, like I said, we have been here for 3 years, but we feel that we have been here for 30 years. We are very comfortable. We walk into any government office like any other local company, and we are engaging the international financial community, different stakeholders with the local people, and making them understand the different challenges and start accepting those challenges and start build trust with each other.
So you're saying you're quite happy with that kind of
Yeah,
process?
we're very, very happy.
You don't want
because
to see anything sort of change. But how long did it take MEC to, from the sort of the blueprint of the project until the implementation?
The blueprint was made in 2008, first quarter of 2008. 2009, second quarter, we got our railway license. And after we got the railway license, it took us about 1.5 years. We've acquired 95% of the land. One more thing is that we have not sat in Jakarta and kept telling the government, you buy the land, I will build the rail. We didn't do that because the government has got other things to do. They've got, social security, they've got other things to run here. What we did was we went in on the ground, started engaging the local villagers, and started talking to them, showing them. We actually made an animated video of what the project will look like 5 years down the line if the railway was built. And these are our villagers who, when they see the video, they like it, they start supporting you. When you have villager support, automatically the government will support you. When you have the government support, not necessarily the villager will support you. That's the difference.
So it sounds like a good example, because land clearance, land acquisition is one of the biggest problems in this country. You didn't have any problems with acquiring land or with...
I think most of the land acquisition problems are in Jakarta, not in Kalimantan or South Sumatra. And I think there are opportunities in these regions also. The business is not only in Jakarta. The business is all over Indonesia. And you need to go into the areas where there is not enough competition, or probably it's because of the competition land acquisition becomes difficult, not necessarily because of government policy. So I guess in Kalimantan or Papua or South Sumatra, there are a lot of opportunities in the region and not much competition, so you can go into those areas.
It's good. It's nice to hear a positive example of infrastructure being built in Indonesia. But if we talk about infrastructure of tomorrow, John, obviously when we build infrastructure, we hope to also build to solve the problems of tomorrow. And the problems that we have at the moment, especially with, for example, the environment, with getting clean water, in using renewable energy, and so on and so forth. And because you're from GE, as a global company, what do you see the main challenges of building and financing infrastructure of tomorrow?
Well, I think if you think about it from our perspective, we have to keep investing in innovative technologies that bring the cost of delivering these capabilities to market lower and lower. So if it costs 90 cents a cubic meter to take the salt out of water, we got to figure out how to make it 80 or 70 cents. We have to figure out how to get affordable healthcare technologies to remote villages that don't have power. So that's a handheld ultrasound that is battery operated. It's all sorts of capabilities that didn't exist yesterday, that some of them exist today and some will exist tomorrow, and we can never stop doing that. It's also figuring out how to connect capital with these big infrastructure projects, because there is lots of money in the world that is interested in investing. Some of it can find projects easily and some of it can't, and we have a responsibility to help with that. I really agree with what Dominic talked about in terms of government's responsibility to create a level playing field and establish rules that are consistent and allow you to see forward a couple of decades. Because if you're investing in these big projects, you don't want to think that the rules are going to change the next time the government changes, and sometimes they do. And the fourth thing I'd say, and this is not something that we talk enough about, like all of you, I travel around a lot, and I'm in a lot of countries where the governments just don't know how to get big projects tendered. It just takes too long, it's not transparent, and you can have all the capital in the world you want, you can have great technology, but if you can't actually get the bidding process done, then you're not going to, then these trillions of dollars isn't going to get spent, or it's not going to get spent soon enough. And that's where I think companies like GE and McKinsey can help create procurement standards which give governments the confidence to move forward with these projects.
Are you talking to the Indonesian government about this, for example?
We talk to everybody about it. We talk to everybody about it because it's hard, it's complicated, the process gets politicized, so I don't want to be naive about it. It's not something you can solve.
You do sound frustrated.
Tomorrow, but it's true. And let me tell you, the Western governments don't necessarily have it figured out either. So this isn't West versus East, but I believe that there are great technologies which can be brought to bear to solve problems today. There's capital that wants to find these projects. We got to make the system, we got to grease the system a little bit to make it work better so that we can get some of this stuff done.
Okay, I'd like to focus on the types of projects that Indonesia, for example, should prioritize. We talk about infrastructure. We also talk about, access to clean water, for example, and power, and so on and so forth. What would be sort of really good projects for Indonesia to prioritize?
Well, I think distributed power is important in Indonesia. You have, people living on 6,000 islands. You've got 15,000 or some number in total. You've got an electric grid which will be very difficult to reach all these people. And so power units in smaller block sizes for, lots for remote villages are, perfect opportunities to solve that problem, or at least help it while you're waiting to push the grid out to people who need it. And I don't think that's a problem that's unique to Indonesia. If you look at Africa, there's 1 billion people on that continent. Probably 500 or 600 million don't have reliable access to power, and it'll be a long time before the grid reaches them too. So it's a similar phenomenon. So smaller power block sizes, power blocks that can run on biofuels or non-natural gas, landfill methane, and coal seam methane, and things like that. All those technologies are available today, and can be used to help.
Like Gita, last but not least. Gita and I, we've been on these sort of infrastructure sessions quite a few times, and I always ask him the same question, basically. When is it going to happen, basically? And so what is happening with the infrastructure? And these are questions that I've been asking, 5, 10 years ago. So tell us, Gita, will we see, new roads soon? We'll see power plants being...
5 years ago, I was on the other side of the panel, and I was the one asking questions. Look, I'm an optimist, and I think many people have known me as an optimist, and let me continue being optimistic today. But before that, I want to just recap some of the challenges that we go through. I think Stuart was so correct in pointing out the limitation from a funding standpoint, and that's not just by virtue of the absence of a mandatory system for people to basically put money in a bucket that would be, funneled to long duration instruments. The pension funds and all the other funds that are here in Indonesia, the local ones, particularly the state-owned, their liquidity amounts to about 40 billion US, and a good chunk of that, if not most of that, is placed in, no longer than 12-month deposits. Not because, these guys don't want to, but there is no proper instrument that would have been created to support the funding and the financing. And I think we're taking the view to basically change that. I'm not saying that things will brighten up tomorrow from a funding instrumentation standpoint, but I think something will happen in the next 12 to 24 months. Now, if we look at the regulatory side of it, I think the one thing that would be a major value unleasher or game changer is the land law, which we haven't been able to get, in the last 25 years. And this land law is something that has been pushed to the Parliament in the last bit of December last year. And I've been called by Parliament a few times to testify and give my views about the world and how that would be useful for Indonesia and Indonesians. And I think from a body language standpoint, they are, I think, leaning towards agreeing with how it should be done to make this, hospitable to the investing community from Indonesia and outside Indonesia. And I'm willing to wager a bet that this thing is going to come out either in the third quarter or fourth quarter. The beauty about this is it's that it's going to, provide certainty with respect to timing and pricing. And that's exactly what business people need when they want to build roads, railroads, ports, power generation, and what have you. The third impediment thus far has been, wanting to do too much with too little bandwidth. That's the temptation and the tendency for bureaucrats in any country. They want to do too much in too little time. And the problem we've had in the last 12 years is, ever since we started talking about, and I'm a bureaucrat, by the way, so 12 years ago we started, tinkering with the idea of PPP, public-private partnership, and nothing got done, until recently. And 8 or 9 months ago, I made the point very vocally to the cabinet that, there needs to be some game changing here, and there needs to be a separation between planning and execution. And guess what? We signed the MOU with the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Planning, and I told everybody at the cabinet that, I'm not interested at all in telling the world that we want to be promoting 50 to 60 different projects. I want to just be telling the world that we want to do just one project. And guess what? We were forced to come to a compromise of outlining or announcing 5 projects within the PPP basket. And one of the 5 got done 2 weeks ago for the first time in 12 years. And this is the Central Java power plant, power generation capability, 2 times 1,000 megawatts. This was, bidded by 2 Japanese and 2 Chinese. And this would have been possible mainly because the government took the view to basically provide a government guarantee, which, the government had never wanted to give the government guarantee to anybody that wanted to finance power generation. So we did it. So we've delivered the baby. And the next one that we have gotten involved with packaging and promoting and all that is the Umbulan water treatment project, which has been pending only since 1968. Okay? This was just about the time when Sukarno was going down. And Sukarno was the first president of the Republic of Indonesia. And we took over and we made sure we sat down with the bupatis, the governors, the parliamentarians at the regional level, and of course all the relevant ministers in Jakarta. And guess what? 29 expressions of interest from really reputable names from all over the world, and we've shortlisted the names to, I think, 7 or 8. And this is highly likely to get done this year. So the message I want to convey is that, yes, it's messy thus far, but there is hope, because there is this little steps that we're taking. We got to continue thinking big and doing small and doing now. And this is exactly what we're doing. And I have complete confidence that we'll be able to get the 2 done this year, so that we can move on to the other 3 out of the 5 that we announced a few months ago. And the other 5 are basically the rail link between Manggarai to Soekarno-Hatta, and the toll road in Kuala Namu to Medan, and the last bit is a simple cruise terminal in Karangasem in Bali. I think Karangasem is a much more doable item, compared to the other 2 remaining. And this, we've basically sat down with the Bupati of Karangasem. This is on the eastern coast of Bali. It's a $40 to $50 million, deal for a cruise terminal to be built. But this is something that has been highly, highly demanded by people in Singapore and Hong Kong who wanted to have a hub in the eastern part of Indonesia so that, the travelers from the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific could see the beauty of the eastern part of Indonesia. I think this has got a good chance of happening. My point, yes, we're not building as many kilometers of roads as the Indians and the Chinese are. By the way, the Chinese came to Indonesia in 1992 to learn how to build toll roads. And we taught them, and guess what? Ever since then, they only built more than 70,000 kilometers of roads. And we've only built 500 kilometers of roads since we taught the Chinese how to do it. And it's predominantly because of the three impediments that I've outlined. But, it's not an impossibility. It takes patience, perseverance, for purposes of basically just sitting down in some remote regions. And, John aptly pointed out the tender regulations. You know what? After or at the same time with the promulgation of the land law, I think we'll be able to complete the revision of Presidential Decree 13. And this is the impediment, because this decree basically tells people that anybody that wants to bid for an infrastructure project, we've got to receive at minimum 3 bids. And this was cutely crafted by some really smart guy in the government many years ago. And guess what? We ended up getting 27 bids from, all the relatives and friends of every bureaucrat in town with no financial and technical wherewithal. In the end, we ended up not being able to deliver. I would rather get a bid or take a bid from Astra or a GE, knowing that, there's no question whatsoever with respect to, and of course with Ajit also, who's qualified, and Madhu, with respect to their technical and financial wherewithal. As long as we know what this project is going to be worth, if it's going to be worth $100, and if they put in a bid at $101, so be it. Let's accept it, and if there's no other bids, get it done. What happened in the past 10, 15 years, we got so many bids, we couldn't get going, and we would review, and we would go to the second round, and we only got 2 bids. A drop from 27 bids to 2 bids, and we would review, and we would decide to terminate the whole process. By that time, it's already 8 years. That's the reality, because people don't have the understanding of how a typical transaction ought to be structured and how a particular package ought to be promoted to anybody who has keen interest in stuff like this. So it's happening, the small steps are being taken, and I think we will have an MRT in Jakarta before I die.
I hope so too. I hope that addresses some of John's frustrations. But before I turn to the audience, let me just ask you one question about this, the land issue regulation or law. When this comes out, how will it work? How does it work? And how basically do you get people to
very simply, it tells people that you go out there and try to do it yourself. Okay? But if and when you cannot succeed, this could be 6 or 12 months. We're in the process of setting the threshold, the timing threshold. The government will intervene and buy the land, take over the land, and by law. So people will have to and will be obligated to deliver the land to the government at a price which will be sensible. And sensibility, I think, comes from some sort of a benchmarking which could be benched against the underlying tax base of the land, or some mutually agreed upon price, between the government and the private sector. But this is a much, better, level than where we have been in the past 25 years.
And you think you're confident that it will work?
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm not worried about the money. I'm worried about, people get it about Indonesia. Indonesia fiscally has been so prudent. We can gloat to the Americans and the Japanese, the Italians and the Portuguese about how we've been prudent on our fiscal management. 26% debt to GDP ratio. We can gloat about our monetary, stability, having managed inflation in an effective and efficient way. We just need to tell the people that, hey, look, we've got some sanity in the way we process things. And that's what we're doing.
Okay. I would now like to invite questions from the audience. Could you please identify yourself and who you would like to address the question to, and where's the mic? Anybody? Yes, there's a gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Vikas Pota. I represent GEMS Education. I suppose this question is to Mr. Gulabchand and to Mr. Koneru in particular. It's to do with, in the West in particular, when we speak about bottlenecks in infrastructure, the issue that you've picked on is land rights, but we're often asked about climate change. And as manufacturing companies or infrastructure companies in this part of the world, how much of a bottleneck is that lobby?
Well, at the present moment, it is a very major bottleneck. Land acquisition and price and compensation for it for eminent domain is under a big question. Is this for a public purpose? When it is going to be finally managed and undertaken by private sector, are you handing over public property under the name of eminent domain to a private sector investor? These are questions that are being asked and raised. In addition to that, India has one more complication, and that complication is we have what is known as agricultural land and non-agricultural land. Whenever land has to be used for other than agricultural purposes, its land use has to be changed. And the moment you change the land use, there is a legitimate question, then who should be the beneficiary of that change? The farmer whose land it has been changed? Should it be the developer who's coming in to develop that new infrastructure project? And then should it be the government who is obliged to provide the infrastructure to make sure that this land becomes usable? These are questions that are still not getting adequately answered. Some piecemeal answers to finding a price for it have come up, but it has never remained satisfactory because it does not really answer these questions. Besides, there is land needed for more industry. And how do you acquire for industry? Should it be under eminent domain? And if not, then how does industry get new land? These are issues that are today really on the debate in India. And some legislations have been passed by, say, for example, the UP state government. The central government, it is begging this legislation and still not come through with it. And therefore, I think we are going to be in the midst of this turmoil of this debate over the next year or so, at least, before we come down to a conclusion, what would be the fair price of land, particularly, and for what should it be fully acquired by government, and what should be left for entirely private sector to do. So it's not a simple problem. It needs to be resolved. It needs to be done, but it has to be constitutionally acceptable. It has to be acceptable to the public at large, that it was fair. And these are some of the issues we face. And that the land values after such new infrastructure coming in changes so much that even the farmers who have sold it 10 years ago want to come forth and say, we got a price that was much less than we should have got. We should also be made beneficiaries, even though we sold this land long ago. So these are issues. Of course this is wrong, but the fact is that we did not know this was going to happen. There was no laid down policy. This is how it will be done. And then the courts tend to hear their pleas. And therefore we have a question here. And I hope that in the next year or two maximum, we would be able to come to some policies. This is again compounded by the fact that there's a central subject and land is a state subject. Getting agreements here are not easy.
But the fact is, Ajit, you still get 1 kilometer of road per day built in India. So
but that's a lot of, as I said, it's a mixed, look, if he's an optimist, I'm an incorrigible optimist. I continue to invest in construction, concessions, and in city developments, in spite of being a victim of all the problems I've said. So the fact is that it still goes on. India is an optimistic story, but it does have these problems.
Okay. More questions, please. Yes, sir.
Good day. My name is Denham. I'm from a company called SNC Lavalin out of Canada. We invest in infrastructure concessions around the world, and in fact, we are an investor in India in both the Mumbai Metro Phase 2 MRT project and most recently a road project in India. And we find India is greatly improved. If you look at the land issue, the road we invested in was under federal law, where the federal government guaranteed that 80% of the land would be available at financial close, and that the balance of 20% would be available within 30 or 60 days of financial close. And these are the kind of guarantees that are required to bring in investors like us. We find, looking around the market, that there are countries that are ad hoc. You know, the deals come out and they're structured every which way. There is countries like Brazil that have structured their terms and conditions of their concession agreements to favor national firms. They really are not tailoring them for international investors. And then there are countries like India that have made a big effort in power and in roads to attract the infrastructure investors like us, and also the big pools of fund money, the Macquaries of the world and so on, to come in and participate in the larger projects in India. And I think my advice to countries is this is what you have to do. You have to benchmark your practices against other countries. If you look at a port project, we'll get a port project on a given day, a port project in India, a port project in Indonesia, and one in Peru. And we were basically comparing jurisdictions to see which offers the best risk-return ratio, and that's where the money goes. And really, this kind of benchmarking is very important, and perhaps something like the World Economic Forum can even help countries benchmark their best practices, benchmark their terms and conditions, and help them tailor them to really attract in the big pools of international money which are out there, and where you know there is plenty of money for infrastructure out there if the risk-return equation is right. And I must admire Chakraborty Commission in India, Minister Kamal Nath, who among other things decided that people have to make money. If infrastructure is going to work as a private investment, the investors have to make money. And once that gets accepted, well, that does light the way for a lot of the changes that have to be made in the terms and conditions of these concessions.
Okay, thank you very much for your input. Any of the panelists would like to respond to the comment? Yeah.
With regard to the practicality side of the countries like India, Indonesia, is that you need to get that one story right, the first one. There are a lot of opportunities. Again, I'll give our project as an example. When the license regulation for private railways was issued in 2009, we were one of the first people who applied, we got it. But there was no second application until first quarter of 2011. In first quarter of 2011, there are 3 projects which have been announced, one in Central Kalimantan and 2 South Sumatra. All 3 of them are private. Most of the investors were primarily waiting to see how our project is developing. Once the project was, they've seen that there's a progress in our project, they all have started applying. So right now there are 4 private railway licenses which are being developed in Indonesia.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, gentlemen.
My name is Fauzi from Standard Chartered Bank. My question to anyone from the panel is that many of the existing investors in infrastructure, for example, the private operators of tap water or ports, have issues regarding the flexibility of tariff, i.e. when they come in, they thought that raising tariff over the next 10 to 20 years throughout the BOT period would be relatively straightforward, but it's not. And they get frustrated, and the projects often become underwater. And how can we ensure that investors who come in have that kind of flexibility or certainty on how to raise tariffs in the future?
Gita?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think this is a great question, because it is highly relevant to a lot of the investors that have invested, particularly in the port sector, container terminal and all that. As much as we are keen on giving the certainty that at least there is not going to be any declination of tariff,
this is a politically sensitive issue, which, the Ministry of Transportation would have to run by the Parliament. And typically parliamentarians are the ones that are gesturing and conveying the sensitivities with respect to, the elasticity of this new pricing mechanism. But this is all going to, not disappear, but I think going to come down as the economy grows and as purchasing power grows and welfare grows and widens. And it is happening already in Indonesia, by virtue of the yardstick of poverty index and unemployment index and the GDP size and all that. I think going forward, we may not have much or as much an issue as we have had the past 12 years. We privatized a port in 1999, okay, to a large conglomerate based in Hong Kong, and I know when they came to Indonesia, they would have wanted us to give some kind of an assurance that tariff would be recalibrated every, so and so years, upward, not downward. And this made life difficult for a lot of the policymakers because, as you know, the early part of the last 12 years were very, very difficult times for us economically from a fiscal and monetary standpoint. But I think going forward, as the economic pie grows, I think we would be in a better position to at least assure that there's not going to be any, not as much sensitivity on raising tariff going forward. Having said that, we're not in any position to basically give certainty on a periodic, tariff hike, that perhaps some investors have voiced. Yeah.
Dominic, would you like? Oh, go on.
Sure. The only thing I would add, I would agree, obviously, with what Gita is saying, but I think it gets, to me, back to this brownfield, greenfield issue again, too, which poses uncertainty. One idea may not be a very good one, but we've often wondered if you got a group, the Asian Development Bank or the World, and this can work in some countries, which comes in as a small part player, but because they're involved in other loans, that there's some surety that they're not, the investors that go with them are not going to be affected by something, because what people worry about is with the government change. I think that's the issue. And is there some way to put some sort of a guarantee in that? Again, there's all sorts of issues probably with that, but that I think is a big factor, because who can tell who's going to come into government? And as everyone's been saying, it's 20 to 30-year money that could wreck the value from it.
John?
It strikes me that there's a kind of a tension here between capital that can go anywhere and needs to have the right risk-adjusted return to come here, with some view that that's going to last for more than 18 months, and the perception that can be created that this is about rich people getting richer and rich companies getting richer and wealth being exported to other places. And so for all of us that do work in developing countries, we got to deal with that perception. So for us, we have to think about bringing in local capabilities and creating, whether it's training or service or manufacturing, because that's our way to avoid the perception that, this is about us selling expensive power equipment or locomotives and making shareholders wealthier in other countries. And so we've got to, all the investors, I think, that work in a country like Indonesia have to deal with that perception. And we all want to make a good return on our investment and satisfy our shareholders. So it's a legitimate tension that we see in lots of countries.
But what are you actually doing in order to perhaps change that perception? Or
we have to be local. We can't. 20 years ago, you could fly in and sell a jet engine and leave and ship your engine in and get paid and live happily ever after. And that day doesn't exist anymore. We have to be working with Garuda on service. We have to have capabilities to assemble and service locomotives. that has to be done, increasingly that has to be done here, not someplace else. Because for us to be successful, we have to be viewed as a citizen of Indonesia, not a global company trying to export wealth, quite frankly.
I think it's also, it's exactly the same point, but expressed in a different way. It's also why you want to develop your domestic capital markets. Because whilst you absolutely want international investors like yourself who are reviewing Peru, South Africa, China and Indonesia on the same day, you want a raft of people who are Indonesian. Basically, the investor of last resort in any country is domestic, and it tends to be its domestic insurance and pension fund industry. That domestic investor is going to have greater empathy with the local situation. It's also, from a positive point of view on your point about tariffs, going to be able to influence, through the normal local processes, the change in attitude towards those tariffs in a way that's not seen as predatory and foreigners benefiting. So the development of domestic capital markets is really critical to sew both of these pieces together.
And how do you see Indonesia's domestic capital market sort of developing in the last few years?
I think that there's absolutely a recognition, and I think it's clear from what you were saying, that that needs to take place. And there are obvious poster children for this around the rest of Southeast Asia. So I think to some extent one's pushing on an open door, but you shouldn't underestimate the degree of difficulty of putting together the entire infrastructure to do it.
One more question. Oh, sure.
Look, I mean, if we take a look at our market cap, the stock market, it is at about, what, 380 billion US. Compare that with our GDP of 720. It runs at a, ratio of 1 to 2, or 50%. Compare it with the US, the ratio is 1 to 1, because their market cap is, around 14 trillion to a GDP of 14 trillion, which tells everybody that, there's still a lot of upside here to go. And that would have to involve, encouraging as many companies as possible to get listed, and as to encourage more liquidity from some of the stuff that we've talked about earlier. And if there's one thing that you all can do to help, further enhance the investment thesis of Indonesia, it's education. And I think you guys, from the corporate side of the game, should really be proactive in looking to support government in Indonesia. And that could mean, sending a government official for a 2-week program somewhere. What you want is for these guys to see the world you do. And this is exactly how we've been doing it. I've been in the private sector for a long time. And, when I go to Papua, when I sit with the governor of Papua or the bupatis of Papua, they don't read the Wall Street Journal. And they don't see the way, the world the way I see it. But the burden of proof is on me to make sure that they get it the way you get it. And it can only accelerate the mediation, the bridging of the two sides. And I tell you, it's going to boil down to how the regional leaders are going to view, on some of the infrastructure projects that are going to have to be built in their regions, Even if we have a land law, but if they don't understand the land law or the implementation of the land law the way we want them to, it's still going to be a stymieing factor. So I think education is key.
Okay, we have more questions. Let's just gather 3 at the same time, because we don't have much time. The gentleman there with your question, and then gentleman over there, and then we have a third one. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. Sandeep from Barclays Capital. Well, we've talked a lot about Asia and the need for infrastructure here. But if you looked at the U.S. and the West, New York hasn't seen any significant up-tiering of their infrastructure for a long time, or the U.S. Is there an opportunity, and to Stuart, to your point, there is the capital from QE2, there are the institutions, the pension funds, the insurance with the longer-term capital. Is there a huge opportunity within the infrastructure world to up-tier infrastructure in the U.S., and will it happen?
I think that the kind of sweet irony in all of this is that a number of the Asian sovereign wealth funds are looking exactly at this, which is investing in the infrastructure of the United States. So I think there's a sort of a political or design issue within certain Asian governments as to where actually they want their surplus funds to go. because that really is happening and that really is getting studied, and yes, that will be an area in which capital is put to work. And there's a substitution level both at the Asian Sovereign Wealth Fund, but also in terms of other investors, in the sense that you have got several of the issues that have been talked about in terms of legal certainty, title to land, all of that is actually quite straightforward. But yeah, the US, one of the ways the US will stimulate its economy and create a whole load of jobs of people earning $50,000 to $100,000 a year is rebuilding its infrastructure.
My name is Pierre Corrad. I'm the president of Goodyear for Asia Pacific, and I would like to bring a testimony about the work that BKPM and the Gita are doing in Indonesia. We have been doing business in this country for 76 years. We opened back in 1935 one of the first large-scale manufacturing sites in Bogor, and ever since we have expanded it and modernized it. Today we make world-class tire that are exported in 52 countries, including in China, which demonstrate that men in Indonesia can compete in China. It is a 24/7 factory. The challenge we face is for the past 7 or 8 months, we are losing power 1.5 days on a monthly basis, which means that we lose power about 5% of the working days we have. If you think about rubber, hot rubber, it sticks. So when we lose power, it takes us a long time to clean some of the pieces of equipment that we have. We are waiting for the power station to come up in line. It has been suggested to us that we put some cogenerations, run some massive diesel generator, which are very noisy, oil thirsty, and of course it's not too good for the carbon footprint. So we cannot wait until the PPP comes on board, and clearly if you think about what a 5% loss in the top line with the gearing does to your bottom line, there is a lot of incremental jobs and tax revenues coming to Indonesia once we can have guaranteed supply and power.
Okay, Gita?
Look, I mean, we've crafted this plan for the next 5 years to basically build 20,000 kilometers of roads and 10,000 megawatts of power generation, or 15,000 megawatts of power generation, translating to 3,000 megawatts per year. And railroads, ports, and airports, for which we estimate, we'll be spending about 160 billion US, of which we have allocated fiscally about 60 billion US. So right there, the delta of 100 billion would have to come from the private sector. And that money ain't going to come until and unless we get our act together in packaging the transaction. And I do believe with the recent development on power generation in Central Java, I think we'll be able to deliver the 15,000 megawatts. And I think you can start planning on building more factories in Indonesia.
I'm afraid I have to wrap up here as we've run out of time. And apologies to those who want to ask questions but don't have the time. But lots of issues, lots of challenges when it comes to implementing infrastructure. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. We still have to fix the regulations, the land issues, the financing, and develop the domestic capital market, as well as educate our local government officials. And with that, I would like to close the session. Big hands to our panelists, Dominic, Madhu, John, Gita, Ajit, Stuart. Thank you very much. I hope it's been useful. Enjoy your stay in Jakarta. Thank you.